So now that we know how we're going to use fiscal policy to combat recessionary gaps, what about inflationary gaps? Let's dive into that and how combating inflationary gaps works using contractionary fiscal policy. Remember, if we're going to be engaging in contractionary fiscal policy, we're going to be actually increasing taxes or decreasing government spending. Essentially, what we're trying to do is we're trying to dampen the aggregate demand. We're trying to shift that aggregate demand actually to the left, to reduce it. And what this does is it actually reduces the existing inflationary pressure. So let's look at how this actually works. Like we said right here, whenever we deal with contractionary fiscal policy, we're going to be increasing income taxes. And that increasing income taxes actually decreases the amount of disposable income that consumers and retained businesses are going to have. Reduces the disposable income of consumers, and it's going to reduce the retained earnings of businesses. It's also going to be decreasing government spending. Whenever we are employing contractionary fiscal policy, essentially what we're trying to do is get people to spend less. We're trying to get households to spend less because they don't have as much in disposable income. We're trying to get businesses to spend less because they don't have as much in retained earnings. We're also trying to get the government to spend less. As they spend less, it actually dampens or shifts that aggregate demand to the left, because if they don't have as much money to spend on stuff, they're not going to be buying as much stuff. If they don't buy as much stuff, the demand for those items goes down. So let's assume that the aggregate demand of the economy is over here at this A5. It's way out here, out on the far right-hand side. And we actually have an inflationary gap. So the inflationary gap is the difference between Y potential and YFE. This right here is our inflationary gap. And like we've been talking about before, we have extremely high prices with a small gain in output as we go from YFE to YPOT. So what we have is these really high prices. That's indicative of this inflationary gap that we're trying to reduce these really high prices. So we employ contractionary fiscal policy. Now it says monetary policy right here. You could also employ monetary policy, but we're going to be employing a contractionary fiscal policy because that's what we're actually talking about in these videos. So we employ this contractionary fiscal policy. It reduces, or it shifts that aggregate demand to the left. So it shifts it from AD5 to AD4. Prices actually fall from P5 to P4. So we have a drastic decrease in prices, and output falls from Y potential to YFE. So we have this small little decrease in output. So our output does decrease, but not by that much. We only have it's really not a significant reduction in our output. So essentially that's how we're going to be reducing our inflationary gaps. We're going to be shifting the aggregate demand to the left back to this YFE, because we're always trying to go to this YFE. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to get people to spend less. We're either going to tax them more, the way they have less disposable income to spend, or we're going to be reducing that government spending to where the government's not buying as much. So what happens if they continue to employ this policy? What if, we're already down here at full employment, but yet the government hasn't realized we're at full employment yet, so they employ another round of contractionary fiscal policy. And what it actually happens is it actually shifts aggregate demand from AD4 to AD3. Prices fall to this P3 range, so we have a decrease in prices. That's good, reducing inflation. But then we have a much more drastic drop in output. And essentially with less output, we're not employing or not at full employment anymore. Since we're not producing as much, we're not having to hire as many people. As we're not hiring as many people, we're no longer at this full employment level. So essentially what we're going to be doing with this fiscal policy, with discretionary fiscal policy and automatic fiscal policy, what we're trying to do is we're trying to combat either inflationary or recessionary gaps. We're always trying to go back to full employment. If we're in an inflationary gap, we're going to be employing a contractionary fiscal policy. That means that we are going to be increasing taxes and reducing government spending. If we are in a recessionary gap and we're trying to get us back to full employment, we're trying to spur on the economy with expansionary fiscal policies. Expansionary fiscal policies is when we're reducing taxes and we are increasing government spending. Essentially, we're trying to spend more in that particular scenario.